Last week we started a new series titled Unsung Heroes. And if I'm going to talk about what an unsung hero is, a hero in terms of the church and a hero in terms of Christianity is someone who is faithfully living out Paul's challenge to Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, Paul says, "But set an example for the believers in speech, in life, in love, in faith, and in purity." He says, this is what I'm challenging you. This is what our call is. Set an example for other people to follow. An unsung hero is setting that example. They may not get much recognition. They may not get props. They may not get an applause, but that doesn't matter to them because their whole focus is just simply on serving Christ. And because they're serving Christ, they're setting an example that other people can follow. Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, when we see people like that, our response should be to honor such people. And to honor people, there's really two ways that I think we can as a church consistently do that. The first way is to, when we see those kind of people around us who are setting those examples, is to take time to say thank you. It's to take time to recognize them. It's why a number of years back, I said this last week, and I'm going to remind you as we go through the rest of the summer, we set up a tradition as leaders. We came up with a list of qualities and characteristics that we wanted to be looking for and recognizing in people who are serving in our ministries. And then we came up with awards. I went out and actually bought trophies for these awards, and I call them trophies. Other people call them junk, but the whole idea is that each year our leadership teams, we've got about 40 people on leadership teams in our church, get to nominate people throughout our ministries for these awards, and the people who win get to take an award home that they get to display in a place of prominence at their house. I mean, who wouldn't want to, do that? And then they get a gift card that goes along with it, and it's just a simple way of saying, hey, we want to be really proactive about honoring people like this. And this morning, actually throughout the summer, we're just going to be honoring those people. We usually do it behind closed doors in a meeting, but we're actually doing it on Sunday morning because, especially as we're going through this series, this is what we ought to be doing as a church. And I got two awards that I'm going to hand out this morning. The first award is what we call our Innovator Award, and we give out an airplane with a clock, both innovations in history. And this goes to someone who is coming up with creative and unique ways to solve problems that we face. And this guy, I will tell you what, if there's a problem solver, a guy who comes up with unique ideas to solve problems, this guy does it, particularly when it comes to things like construction. He got nominated for a number of things that he's done, but one in particular, we had a work day at the starting of the summer, and he came with a massive truck and an earth mover of some sort and was ripping out all the old overgrown bushes using that and throwing it in the truck, and he certainly deserves this award. The Innovator Award goes to Michael Borsellino for all the work that he does on that. So, thanks, man. I appreciate it. Thanks for all you do. Yeah. Now, we give a gift card out as well, but I owe him a gift card, and here's why, is because I know that the coffee that he likes to drink is not Starbucks, and I've got Starbucks cards, so I owe you Dunkin' Donuts, okay? And I will get that to you. The next award is our Multiplier Award. That's what this statue represents, a cowboy raising up another cowboy. And I'll tell you what, the person that is winning, the whole idea of this is that we're a church that we're about multiplication. We want to train and raise up leaders and followers of Christ. We're not about just all staying in the same place. We want to always be challenging ourselves to develop people around us. And this person is someone who does that all the time. She is an unbelievable, faithful servant. She blows me out of the water all the time, just with how faithful she is. And I'm so grateful for her. And I'll tell you what, this award this year for her is at the start of the fall last year. She's been leading the way in our local missions, in particular in our relationship with the local schools, District 202. And I set a goal. My goal was to triple the number of people we had engaged in going and mentoring students over at Lincoln Elementary School. We had 3 or 4 people, and I wanted to get us up to 15. And she led the way on that, and we hit that mark this year, and now she's setting more goals to see that continue to grow. And you know her. She does an absolutely fantastic job. This year's Multiplier Award goes to Leslie Wiseman. So. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Leslie. So that's one of the ways that we can honor such people. And I know it's just a simple thing, but let me just tell you this. Look, we have over 80% of our congregation is involved in serving in some consistent ministry. And there's so many people around us who are the unsung heroes. And so my challenge to you, and by the way, we're praying for the other 20% of you. We love you. We're glad you're here. But let me just tell you, God has great things that he wants to do in and through us as a church. And the ways that he does those great things in us as a church is through us as a community, as we partner together. God's given you gifts and he wants to use you, especially as we start a second service. God wants to continue to grow us and to grow you. And so be praying about your place. But those other 80% of people that we see are serving around us, I just want to encourage you, look around. Who are the people that you see? That you need to just stop and say, hey, thank you for being such a great example. Thank you for showing us what it looks like to serve and to follow Christ. Who are those people? But there's a second way that I believe that we ought to be honoring those kind of people. And quite frankly, I think it's the best way that we can honor those types of people, is that we can learn and grow from their examples so that we become examples that other people might follow. And that's really the hope of this series as we're looking at some unsung heroes in Scripture, people that set an example. They often aren't really recognized or talked about, and yet there is so much. They show us and teach us so much. In particular this morning, last week we looked at an Old Testament king, Josiah. This morning we're actually looking at a servant girl. We don't even know her name. She's given just a few verses in the Bible, and yet here's what I will tell you. There is more that she can teach us than we have time to even talk about this morning. In just a few verses, there's so much that we can learn. Would you stand with me? Let's pray, and then we'll read our passage together. Father God, thank you so much for faithful men and women who set examples for us. I thank you for Leslie, and I thank you for Michael, and for the ways that they serve you and your people. And also, God, they serve us not just by getting people involved and not just by doing projects, but by setting an example that we can actually follow. Thank you for the encouragement that they are, and for all of those who set that example for us, especially this morning as we look at this one unnamed girl who sets a stage, sets a direction, sets a challenge on the table for us. Lord, that I pray today that we might receive it. Teach us through your word, I pray, and God, may our response be a yes to what you call us to. In Jesus' name, amen. 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his Lord, "Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel." And the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy." And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man sends a word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me." But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king and saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, "Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. And are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in rage. But his servants came near to him and said, "My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan River according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him, and he said, "Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel." This is God's word. You can go ahead and be seated. Yeah, one of the things that I love about this story is that there are these amazing, powerful, famous people throughout the whole thing. I mean, you've got 2 kings, you've got a prophet, you've got a highly successful general of the Syrian army, you've got all of these famous, powerful people, and yet we're not talking about any of them this morning. We're talking about a girl, an Israelite girl who became a servant, and we don't even know her name. And the reason we're focusing on her is because she sets an example for us that ought to deeply challenge us in the way that we live today and encourage us when it comes to fulfilling God's call on our lives. It ought to deeply challenge us and encourage us, especially when we think about the context of her story. Because the context of her story is suffering. I mean, if you look at verse 2, it's just a sentence, and yet there's a massive story that it's telling. And the story is this, that once upon a time, and this isn't a made-up story, it's a reality, so don't hear once upon a time we're making up a story. No, that once there was a family in Israel, a young couple, husband and wife, who became a mom and dad. They had a daughter, a baby girl. And they get to watch their daughter growing up and develop friends and learn new things and start saying her first words. And they had their family around them in Israel, and they had a life. And all of that gets taken away because a Syrian raiding party under the command of Naaman gets sent in, and they steal this girl from her home. We don't know what happens to her family. We don't know anything about what happens with them. We can make some guesses that potentially they get killed in the raid, and she gets kidnapped and carried as a captive back to Syria. Regardless, she gets kidnapped, taken back to Syria. She's put in the house of the general, Naaman, where she's forced to be a servant to his wife. That's the background of suffering. If there's suffering to be talked about for a child, this is it. And I want you for just a moment to try to imagine yourself in that situation, and 2 questions I want to ask you. How would you feel and how would you respond and live in that situation? In particular, I want you to think about this. How would you respond to Naaman, and how would you treat him? I mean, you've lost everything. You've lost your family, you've lost your home, you've lost your friends, you've lost your culture, you've lost your freedom. She went from daughter, she became a slave, and she is now serving as a slave, not just any house. The house that she's serving in is the house of Naaman, and he's the reason that she's there. He's the reason that she's lost everything. Because he's the general that sent the raiding party that maybe killed her family and took her captive and brought her back. And she's serving in the house of her enemy. And not only is he her enemy, but here is a successful military leader, famous, and yet he's got a problem. He's got leprosy. He's got a skin-eating disease. Not so bad that he can't do his job, but it's a serious condition, and she knows the cure. And thinking about all of that, how do you respond to Naaman in that moment? Do you respond with revenge, with bitterness, with hatred, with anger, or do you respond with compassion, grace, and mercy? And that's why I say this story should deeply challenge us, because I think for lots of people, it's hard enough to respond with compassion and mercy to somebody who cuts us off on the road, let alone somebody who's killed our family and kidnapped us and taken into captivity. It's hard enough for us to have patience with somebody who has 16 items in the 15-item line, let alone to now be going, how do we respond to the people who hurt us? I mean, really hurt us. How do we treat them? See, it would be so easy. Here she has the cure. She's got the solution. She knows he can get better. He's been searching for it. He hasn't found it. She knows where it is. It'd been so easy to go, you know what? Revenge. I know the cure, but I'm not going to tell you. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to watch you suffer and die. You took my family from me, and now you're going to lose your life, and I'm going to watch it happen. It would have been so easy for her to use manipulation. I mean, at least use it as a power play, right? Go to him and say, hey, listen, I know the cure. I know how you can get better, and I'll tell you as long as you let me go. I mean, that would be wisdom in some ways, wouldn't it? I mean, it would be easy for us to think that way, and yet she doesn't choose either one of those. What does she choose? She chooses to give grace and to speak hope. She speaks 10 words in the original language of hope that sets Naaman on a journey where he experiences not just physical healing, but the ultimate healing of his soul. He gets his eternity changed because she chose grace for her enemy. And she gives us such an amazing example. I said it, there's so much that she ought to teach us about, challenge us on, and teach us about how we ought to be living our lives in the world today. But let me give you the one. Here's the big idea that I'm going to focus on today. It's this, is that she teaches us that a hero lives sent. A hero is someone who lives sent in the middle of suffering. Add that on to that statement because that is absolutely critical to thinking through what she's doing. And when I'm talking about living sent, to live sent means wherever I am, however I get there, I'm living on mission with God to the world, even to my enemies. I'm going to say that again. To live sent, and you're going to hear this again because this, quite frankly, is going to be our theme for the year coming up. I'm giving you a preview. To live sent means that wherever I am, however I get there, I'm living on mission with God to the world, even and especially to my enemies. Which, by the way, isn't that the Great Commission? Isn't that what our call is as the church? Matthew chapter 28, what does Jesus tell us? He says, go therefore into all the world. I want to clarify that for just a moment because we tend to think of that as a choice. It's when I go, I'll go and do this. But the original language is as you're going. In other words, it's not when you go, it's you're going to be going. Wherever you are, however you get there, what are we supposed to do? Go therefore in all the world, as you're going into the world, make disciples. Wherever you are, however you get there, you and I have been called to engage on mission with God to the world, even to our enemies. That's our calling. And here's a little girl in the Old Testament who, quite frankly, ought to really convict us in a lot of ways by her example, but also encourage us in terms of living it out. We're going to live that. We got to learn from her example. All right, so I'm actually going to give you 4 things because I'm going to combine the last 2 into one point, okay? But here's point number 1. If we're going to actually do this, if we're going to live sent, then number 1, you've got to stand in faith, even and especially in loss. Here she is, and she has suffered massive pain, loss in her life, her family, all the things that we've already said. And in that moment, it would have been so easy for her to start asking the question that everybody asks in suffering, which is what? What's the question we ask when we're suffering? Why? Everybody asks it. And let me just tell you, that's not a bad question to ask. You were made to ask that question. It's a question of purpose. The problem isn't the question. The problem is the way that we ask it. And the way that we tend to ask the question is not in faith, but in doubt. And here's the way we ask it. If God is so good and so loving and all-powerful, then why is this happening? It's not a question of faith. It's not God is all good and he's all-powerful and he's all-loving, yet this is happening. It's if that's true, then why is this? It puts us in this place of dilemma where we're going, I don't understand how these things go together. And quite frankly, it's one of those things that leads to, for many, a crisis of faith. In fact, just this last week, I was reading an article about a man, a singer-songwriter that I used to listen to. I loved his music. He had such deep, powerful lyrics that were challenging and convicting. I thought music that the church needed at the time. And yet I read an article this week in which he denounced Christianity, he denounced belief in God, and the reason he gave is this. He said, I look at suffering in the world and I've decided there's only 2 options. Either A, there's no God, or B, the God that exists is just a jerk. And I don't want to worship him. And by the way, use more colorful language than that. I won't use it here this morning. But he says, those are the only 2 options. And by the way, that's such an easy place to go when you look at suffering because we're looking, we're going, why the cancer? Why the loss? Why the depression? Why the anxiety? Why? And if we're honest, maybe 100% of the time when we're going through it, we don't know the answer to the why. And that confusion very easily can lead to doubt and giving up on God and faith. And yet here's a girl in the middle of it all, and she doesn't do that. She doesn't give up on God. She doesn't give up on faith. Instead, she makes an absolute confident faith statement when she talks to Naaman's wife. She says, oh, that my master, oh, that he would be with the prophet in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy. And let me just decode that for you for a moment. Because she's not just talking about the prophet. The reason the prophet can heal is because God is working through the prophet. And in this moment, she's saying, listen, God can do it. God can heal him. I might be suffering, but that doesn't change who God is. I might not understand why I'm going through this, but I still believe in God who is good, loving, and all-powerful, even in the midst of the questions that I don't have the answers to. Here is a little girl who has more faith in the middle of her suffering and pain. If you're going to live sent, that's where you have to get to be able to say, I may not understand it, but I still believe. And you say, well, how do I get there? Well, I'll tell you, it actually is right here in the passage. Verse 1, look at it again, because the answer's there and it's easy to miss. It says, Naaman, commander of the army and the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. Do you see what it just said there? Why has Syria had victory? Who gave them the victory? The Lord did. In other words, here's what that says. Now, that should, to some of us, that's going to shake us a little bit. But here's what that says. That the reason that that's happening is because God is sovereign, ruler over all things, and is seated on the throne. There is no accident. There is no mistake. It is not a coincidence that this girl has now ended up in Naaman's house in Syria. There's no chance to that. She may be suffering, but she's sent. There may be pain, but God has a purpose in it. You can see it throughout the whole Bible. It's Paul and Silas in the prison in Philippi. If they weren't there, the Philippian jailer never would have heard the gospel and had his eternity changed. It's the Jews, the Messianic Jews, the followers of Christ in Jerusalem when Stephen is martyred and they're sent out by persecution. And what do they do as they go? They share the gospel. If they stayed, nobody would have heard. But because they're suffering, they're sent. Why is it that this little girl is in Syria suffering? Here's why. Because God sent her into a place where there is a man who needs his eternity changed. The problem isn't whether or not there's a purpose. The problem is whether or not we'll stand in faith and in agreement with God and his purpose. That's the issue. And here's a real challenging question for you to think about. Noodle on this for a little bit. Would you be willing for God to take your home, your family, and your freedom to send you to a place where there is somebody who is lost and threatened with an eternity separated from him forever, so that you might be there and share the gospel and they might be saved forever? Would you be willing to have that happen? Nobody would choose it. Nobody's like, well, sign me up for that. Right? But this is, in my mind, it's Jesus in the garden who prays, Father, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, your will be done. Would I be willing, if that was God's will, his choice, to send me on mission so that someone might hear that otherwise wouldn't hear? Would I be willing to say, God, I may be suffering, but you're sending me and I'm going to work with you in that. I'm going to stand in faith even in the middle of that. You're going to live sent. That's where you have to get to, and that's what she does. Number 2, if you're going to live sent, you have to turn outward instead of turning inward. You have to turn outward instead of inward. And this is a really hard thing because, listen, in our suffering, it's so easy to focus on ourselves and to go, well, I just need to focus on me, take care of me, and then once I've taken care of me, then I'll get to you. Right? I'm going to stop worrying about everybody else, and I'm just going to focus on myself. I'm going to start stop concerned about everyone out there. In particular, by the way, I'm going to stop thinking about people if they're my enemies who have hurt me in this moment. I'm going to just focus on me. I mean, that's the setting that she's in, isn't it? She's been injured. She's been hurt. He's the reason for it. Naaman is the reason for it. And it would have been so easy for her to make excuses. It would have been so easy for her to go, I'm just going to take care of me. I'm suffering. I'm in this terrible spot. Who cares about Naaman? He's a bad guy. I'm just going to focus on me instead of focusing on others. But instead, what does she do? She, in fact, shows us what Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5, do you remember what Jesus says? He says, but I say to you, love your enemies. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. He says, you want to know how to reflect who God is? Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Not pray that they might suffer, but pray that they might be saved, which is exactly what she does. Do you see it? When she talks to her mistress, when she talks to Naaman's wife, it's a prayer. She doesn't just give factual information. There's a prophet and he heals people and he's in Samaria. No, look at what she says. Look at verse 2 again. Look at verse 3. She said to her mistress, would that my Lord, oh, that Naaman, if only Naaman would go to Samaria to the prophet, he could be healed. Do you see the longing? So you want to live sent, especially to your enemies, which, by the way, is exactly where God's calling us. Then you've got to get to the place where you're actually praying for your enemies. You are loving your enemies in a way that seeks their rescue and salvation. And how do you get there? Here's how you get there. Number one, you remember who you are and where you've come from. That you were once an enemy of God, deserving his judgment. And instead of judgment, God sent his Son into this world with compassion, moved to action and kindness, to live the life you couldn't and die the death you deserved so that you might be rescued and saved. When you don't love your enemies, it's because you've forgotten who you were and what God's done for you. Number two, if you want to get there, you need to remember who these people are who have hurt you. They are actually not your enemy. Paul says it in Ephesians, we do not battle. We are not in a war against flesh and blood. We are in a war against the powers and the forces of darkness. When we hate the people around us who have hurt us, we've forgotten that the reason that they are the way that they are is not just, yes, certainly there's choice involved, but they are under the power and the authority of the kingdom of darkness. And if we are going to rebel and fight against him, the greatest rebellion against the devil is to see people rescued and saved. It's to live on mission with him. Number three, if you're going to, and by the way, again, that's what she does. What she does. She loves her enemy and prays for him, which is what we've been called to do. Number three, we need to remember that influence is not defined by affluence. Affluence, by the way, is not just money, it's also success. That's what Naaman has and the servant girl doesn't have. I mean, think about the differences between Naaman and the servant girl. I mean, he's older and experienced. She's young and inexperienced. He's more mature. She's immature. He's a captain. She's a captive. He has success. She appears to just be living in failure. She's a servant. She's a slave because she's lost everything. He's famous. We don't even know her name. He can influence a king. She's a servant to his wife. And it would have been so easy for her to go, what's the point of even saying anything? They won't listen to me. What's the point of speaking up? It's not going to make a difference. Who's going to listen to us? Why in the world would the captain, the general of a Syrian army with all the power and success and money he has, why would he listen to a little servant girl? It would have been so easy for her to say, forget it, what's the point? Instead, she speaks up. And she speaks grace, regardless of what they're going to do with it. I'm going to speak into this situation. Listen, I really believe that one of the reasons that we don't live sent as Christians today is because we buy into weakness mindset. We buy into this weakness mindset that says it doesn't matter if I say anything, nobody's really going to listen anyway. I don't have the wisdom, I don't have the intelligence, I don't have the knowledge, I don't have the answers that I need. And so what's the point of saying anything to anyone anyway? Because it's not going to make a difference. And we buy into this idea that affluence is connected to influence. If I have enough, then I can influence, but I don't have enough, therefore I don't say anything. But I just need to tell you this morning. That's really bad thinking. And it's not true. It's wrong. And let me tell you just two reasons why. Number one, you have unbelievable influence in this world right now, and here's why. Because we live in a world with people who are exactly like Naaman. They may not have a skin disease, but every person in this world deep down knows that there is a brokenness in their lives that they are seeking a cure for, and they're trying all sorts of things, and the majority of people aren't finding the solution. They're looking, and get this, you have the cure. If you're a follower of Christ, you know what the world needs, and you have the one message by which everyone can be saved. The gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. You have the answer. It should blow your mind that this servant girl says, go to Samaria, and there's a prophet, you'll get healed. And the general of the Syrian army goes, when do I start? I mean, that's insanity. You're going to follow the direction of a servant girl? How does that work? Here's how it works. Because he was desperate. He had tried everything else and nothing had worked, and he got in the place of desperation so that when a servant girl says, here's the answer, he goes, tell me how to get there. Years back, I was in a place physically where my body was falling apart. I mean, physically, I was in so much pain. Walking upstairs, I would get out of breath. It felt like I had vices around my lungs that were squeezing. I couldn't get a good breath in. I was in and out of the hospital. I was going to doctors, and they just kept throwing more pills and more pills and more pills. I thought I was dying. That's really where I was. Literally thought I was dying. And one Sunday morning here at Grace Point Plainfield, 6 years ago, I got a guy come up to me after service, and he said, this is going to sound crazy, but I think God's telling me to come and tell you that I can help you. It's going to be a little bit weird, but I'll just tell you, you got to come over to my house, come down in my basement, and I do some manipulation that's probably the most painful thing that you'll ever experience, but I think you'll walk out and you'll be better. Now, most people on a sane morning would probably be like, and again, I didn't really know this guy. Probably be going, I'm not coming over to your basement, you're not going to hurt me. But you know what I said? I said, when do we start? Like, you want me to come over right after church today? Like, when do we get this done? Why? Because I'd gotten to a place of desperation. Nothing else worked. And I'll just tell you, I went over to his house. We talked through it. He said, listen, I bet you. He said, I believe God working through me in 5 days, your lungs will stop hurting. 5 days later, my lungs stopped hurting. But it was insanity. And it was the most pain I've ever experienced in my entire life. But God had a cure. And it sounded crazy at the time, but I was willing. Why? Because I got to a place of desperation. See, that's the world. We live in a world of desperation. But people are on a search, and you've got a cure. And not only that, let's just remember that when Jesus says, go therefore into all the world and make disciples of all nations, right before that he says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. He's got all the authority. And then the last thing he says after the Great Commission is, and surely I'm with you until the very end of the age. In other words, the one who conquered sin and death, the one who created the universe that is so vast our minds can't comprehend it, and he created it by the power of his word, is the one who is with you, who is working in you, who is working through you, and you say that you don't have influence? You're saying you don't have power? You're saying that you can't do this? You've forgotten who you are. You've forgotten who is with you. Influence is not shaped by affluence. Influence is not shaped by the visible. It is shaped by the invisible, omnipotent God who is working in and through you. You're going to live sent. You got to walk in the confidence of that. That's what you have to do. Number 4 and 5, I'm going to put them together. All right? 4 and 5. If you're going to live sent, number 4, then you have your role. You have to live as a link in the chain of grace. Number 5, as you point people to the one who can heal. Live as a link in the chain of grace as you point people to the one who can heal. I love the fact that when Naaman finally gets to Elisha's house, which is where he should have gone in the first place, instead of the king of Israel, because he had no power to heal. When he gets to Elisha's house, Elisha doesn't even come out, which is very offensive. He's going, how dare you not? Do you know who I am? I got all this money, I've got all this power, I've come for you to heal me. And he, by the way, came with expectations that Elisha is basically another shaman that I can buy off, and he'll wave his hand over my leprosy and magic, poof, it's gone. And Elisha doesn't even come out. He sends a servant, he says, go wash in the river 7 times. Why? Do you know what I see here in this moment is Elisha is going, I want you to be very clear at the end of the day who it is that heals you. It's not me. It's Yahweh. He's the one that heals, and I'm just simply a link in the chain of grace. I'm just simply here to point you to the one who can heal you because it isn't me. And that's what every single one of them is doing. That's what this little girl does. And think about how important it was that she was that link in the chain of grace. She didn't have to get him across the line. All she had to say was, you can get healed over there. And see, that's the way it works. I really believe that part of our struggle with living on mission is we've placed all of this responsibility on ourselves that doesn't belong to us. We bought into this idea that in order for people to get saved, we're the ones that have to save them. And so we every conversation, we're kind of going, I've got to get people across the line, and if I don't get them across the line, then I've failed. And so we're walking around like desperate salesmen that are trying to close deals, and we're so desperate we end up not telling anybody anything because we're so afraid of the failure. Do you understand? Nobody in this room can save anyone. That's not your responsibility. That's not your job. That's what God does. Here's what your job is. Your job is to be a link in the chain of grace as you point people on their journey to the one who can actually heal them. You are not a deal closer. You are not a salesman. You are a spiritual trail guide that is pointing people to the next step on their journey. And maybe that'll be praying with them to accept Christ, or maybe it'll just be a first step in that journey as you kind of build a relationship with them. They're not ready for that yet. Naaman wasn't ready for that when the girl told his wife. He wasn't even initially ready when Elisha told him to go wash in the river. He needed his servants to speak up. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. He says it this way. He says, "What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, and God gave the growth." Who gives the growth? Who gives the growth? What's your responsibility is to be a link in the chain of grace. And here's what that means. Number one, you have to know where people are on their journey, and that requires a relationship. It requires getting to know people. You're not pitching a product. You're building relationship and helping them on their journey. Number two, it requires you to know where they're going. Where can they get healed? The good news is we know the answer to that question. And then number three, it takes knowing what's the next step. That's all you're helping people to do, is what's the next step on their journey to get closer to God on that journey. What's their next step? And you know what that requires? It requires being sensitive to God and the leading of the Spirit in your life. Because you don't know everything, but God does, and He knows exactly what they need, and He will show you the need, and He will show you where they are as you pursue Him in relationship. That it is this partnership as you develop relationship with others, as you pour into their lives, that He leads you so that you can know and help them on just what's that one next step. Be a link in the chain of grace. That's your call, and that's what she did. And not only was he healed, but his eternity gets changed forever. We're going to see Naaman one day. Because a little girl was willing to stand in faith in the middle of her suffering and to live sent. And that's our call. Two things that I want to just say before I finish. Number one, some of us here this morning, we're not ready to live sent because we haven't yet even received. And I'm just going to tell you, some of us are here this morning and we're like Naaman. We've got this deep down sense that there's a brokenness and you're searching for the cure. And look, I'm up here. I don't know where you're at on that journey and I don't know what the next step is. But I'm just going to tell you this morning the cure for the longing in your life. There is a cure and His name is Jesus Christ. That's the cure. It's a solution. And I'm speaking from experience in my own life, having tried all sorts of other things to fix the brokenness in me. There is one thing. And it's Him. And I get it. I know what that sounds like to some of us sitting in the room. We're like Naaman and going, why this river? Why can't I choose whatever river I want? This is insanity. I would challenge you to think of it as simply as this. If I invited you over to my house for lunch today, which I won't, my wife isn't here, so, I'm barely surviving, so... Maybe next week. If I were to invite you over to my house today and you said, yeah, I'd love to come over. I'd say, great, I'll see you there. And you say, well, how do I get there? I just pick your own road. Just start driving, you'll make it there. What are the chances that you're going to arrive there? See, I wouldn't do that. Why? Well, because I'm really inviting you. You know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say, hey, listen, take Route 30. I won't tell you all the details right now, but I will tell you the exact direction. I will give you my address. Why? Because I care and I actually want to eat with you. And what God is simply doing is He's saying, I want a relationship with you. Let me tell you the way. You get to choose. You can go dip in another river, but it isn't going to heal you. This is the one place that you can find that cure. And it may sound crazy to you, but don't pass it over quickly. Jesus, throughout His ministry, heals again and again, physically heals. There's a place in Matthew 8 where there's a leper who comes to Him and says, if you will, I can be clean. And Jesus says, I will be clean. And instantly He's made clean in that moment. Instantly. And Jesus shows not just what He has the power to do physically, but He's showing in the physical what He can do spiritually. And He has the power to heal and to cure you of the deepest sickness and brokenness of your life. And it's called sin. that he went to the cross and died in your place to pay the penalty for, so that you could be rescued and saved. Don't pass by it quickly. Come and see. Be willing to come in faith and say, if you will, heal me. And every time someone comes and says that, he says, I will be healed. Every time. Second and last thing is, for those of you who say, I have believed this message, then listen, you know that leper? That leper gets healed, and Jesus says to him, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. And he's not playing mind tricks. He's literally saying, don't go and tell anybody. It's not a game. But you know what? That leper goes out and he cannot contain himself. Having been commanded by Jesus to say nothing, he goes and he begins to tell. You can read it in Matthew 8, Mark chapter 1. And he makes Jesus so famous that Jesus can't even go into the towns anymore because everybody's so excited. He goes and makes people famous. He goes and makes Jesus famous so that people are so excited to meet Jesus. He's got to be on the outside of town, having been told to not go. And here we are, and how often is it that we're trying to be compelled to go, and we're going, yeah, no, I don't really want to do that. What's the difference? What happened in there? I'd say somewhere along the way, we forgot how amazing it is that God has healed us. We've been comfortable with grace. We've been accustomed to the wonder and the awe of the God who has healed us eternally. And our prayer this morning ought to be a prayer of confession. Not that we just confess, Lord, I haven't been living sent, but that we confess the reason for not living sent, that we've lost the awe that he came and did this for us, for you.